It's often said that Batman has the best rogues gallery of any comic book superhero. The Joker, Two-Face, Scarecrow, Catwoman, Bane, Killer Croc, Clayface. The list goes on and on. And, call it surprising, strange, or clever, but those creating and writing Batman media, whether it be in the comics, movies, television, animation, or video games, they tend to place an equal amount of focus and care on not only the Caped Crusader himself, but also on his villains. This, in turn, is what results in the most memorable and beloved rogues gallery ever made in fiction. What's perhaps most interesting about both Batman and the various foes he faces is that the people behind the stories that feature them are not afraid to really mess with and reinvent these characters, all in service of a greater story. Much like how Batman has seen several reinventions over the years, so too have some of his best villains. We got the definitive take on the Joker in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, where Joker morphed from the clown prince of crime to a twisted, psychotic agent of chaos that Heath Ledger expertly portrayed. We got a twisted, broken version of Catwoman in Batman Returns, and of course, various definitive takes on many of the villains in the 1990s Batman the Animated Series. And now, in 2024, with the release of the Penguin miniseries on the Max streaming platform, yet another Batman villain has not only gotten his due, but has been perfected, truly reaching his potential as a character. Ozz Cobb, the Penguin, played by Colin Farrell in both 2022's The Batman and this latest Max miniseries, is a version of the character that we've not only not seen before, but one that is a part of yet another piece of media that transcends the idea of an adaptation of a popular character and becomes its own standalone thing. And to top it all off, this is a story that can stand toe-to-toe with some of television's best TV shows and properties of all time. There's so much depth, nuance, artistry, and expert storytelling packed in this 8-episode series that it makes it really worth examining and exploring. Why is this version of Batman's villain, known as the Penguin, not only so good, but why does he stand out as the best version of the character ever in any form of media to date? So, let's explore that whole idea and everything related to it. Let's take a long, hard look at all the different versions of the Penguin and how they all relate to and compare with the version that we got in this phenomenal piece of television. A bit of a warning before we begin. This video will spoil all 8 episodes of the Max Penguin miniseries. So, if you haven't seen the Penguin yet, then I'd highly recommend you go and do so first. Beyond that, there will also be spoilers and references to other media that the title character of the Penguin has appeared in, whether it's animation, comics, movies, or video games. If any of that is an issue for you, then as always, viewer discretion is advised here. To begin this little exploration exercise, I think it's best to start by taking a general look at the Penguin across all the various Batman media that have come out since he was created. Let's take a quick look at what the character's origins are, his original core concept, and then we can compare it to the most recent version. To that end, first of all, there's the comic book version. The Penguin, as he's known in the comics, is actually a round, plump, and short crime boss that's actually fairly close in terms of physical features to an actual penguin. In the original idea in the comics, the Penguin actually has deformities at birth, and it's his unusual looks and body that not only subject him to ridicule, but ultimately push him towards his inevitable life of crime. And the best place to get his definitive and currently most widely accepted comic book origin is in the 6-issue miniseries titled Penguin, Pain and Prejudice. It's here that we actually learn the Penguin's real name, Oswald Cobblepot. Cobblepot is actually the important bit here, as it's his family name that contributes a lot to the early anguish that ultimately forms his character. The story goes something like this. Oswald is born into a rich family known as the Cobblepots, who in many Batman comic book stories throughout the ages are shown to be just as affluent and important in Gotham City as the Wayne family. The twist here, of course, is that unlike the Wayne family that maintains its wealth despite the various tragedies that befall them, the Cobblepots lose it all. And that is likely one of the main reasons behind Oswald needing to dive into and climb on top of the dark underbelly of Gotham. Oswald, the Penguin, doesn't have Bruce Wayne or Batman's resources or wealth, and his birth defects and strange appearance cause him to be a real outcast, ridiculed and picked on by those around him from a very young age. And after that difficult childhood, it's in adulthood that Oswald becomes the Penguin, rising through the ranks of Gotham's criminals and ultimately opening his own club called the Iceberg Lounge, where he serves as a weapons dealer and broker for the criminal underworld of Gotham. Okay, so I think it's worth noting that that overview is a bit of a mishmash of a few different comic book storylines and tidbits from various Batman stories here and there. But I think it's safe to say that it should at least paint a picture of what Batman fans and readers of his comics know the Penguin to be. Now, when looking back at the comics, it's actually interesting to note, particularly when comparing Oswald Cobblepot to the version found in both Max's The Penguin and Tim Burton's Batman Returns movie, that despite whatever physical defects or appearance issues the Penguin has, he's actually a highly educated, smart, and clever criminal that's both fairly sane and pretty normal as far as human beings go. The Penguin is actually known to be trained in martial arts, for instance, and is fairly inventive on the weapons front as well, using things like his umbrella to hide a gun, and he runs a successful criminal empire. So there's a lot here that's different from what we see in other forms of media. And those aspects from the comics are featured in those other forms of media to various degrees and levels. The Batman animated series, for example, simply featured the Penguin as a crook and criminal gang boss. Tim Burton's The Batman Returns, on the other hand, featured a more horrific, monstrous, and body horror version of the Penguin, one that's more animal and mutation rather than human. Which, of course, brings us to the rather interesting version of the Penguin that we see in the Max series. Here, we have a real departure from the comics in a lot of ways, starting with the Penguin's real name, which is Oswald Cobb, not Cobblepot. Oswald, or Oz as he's referred to in the show, also isn't born into wealth, nor is he part of Gotham's elite, as is the case in both the comics and even Tim Burton's Batman Returns movie. Instead of all of that, Oz in the show comes from a humble working-class family and rises through the ranks of the Carmine crime family, starting from essentially nothing and having no relation to either the underworld of Gotham or the city's elite. And yes, that's actually a change that was introduced in Matt Reeves' The Batman movie, but it's really the cornerstone of who Oz is in this series as well. Oz is shown as an underdog, a grunt, who's been serving as one of Carmine Falcone's lieutenants, but is nowhere near the top echelon of the Falcone crime family itself. Incidentally, looking to the end of 2022's The Batman movie, it's in the events of the film that Carmine Falcone, the kingpin of Gotham, is killed, and a power vacuum emerges in Gotham's criminal underworld as a result. And it's here that we rejoin Oz as he struggles to not only survive, but move up in the underworld, seeing both the death of Carmine Falcone and the destruction caused by the Riddler to Gotham in the movie as an opportunity to become something more. What's striking from the very first episode of the series is just how much added depth is put into the character of the Penguin, and how the series changes him from the comedy relief side character in the movie to a menacing, confident, and driving force of a protagonist in the show. The change here really echoes back to a relatively unexplored idea in the comic books. There's actually a scene in one of Batman's comics where Bruce Wayne remarks on how the Penguin may actually be smarter than him. Yet, it's the Penguin's fixations and character flaws that prevent him from getting the upper hand in their encounters. It's this idea that is both expanded upon and really used to great effect in the whole series. Ozz is shown to be a really clever and smart guy here. He has a real talent for figuring out what people want to hear, and then he uses it to get in real close. He's a masterful manipulator with quite a bit of charm, but what limits him, as we see in the very first episode, is his own insecurities and huge ego. Ozz, despite how much he tries to come off as a harmless, helpful, and humble guy, actually has a huge ego and an incessant need to be liked, adored, and appreciated. And so, every action the guy takes is to both further himself and get the adoration and respect that he feels he deserves. And it's all good as long as his efforts pay off and he gets what he wants. Until, of course, they don't and he doesn't. If someone hits a nerve, even if it's just in jest, then Ozz will drop all pretenses and lash out, really unable to control himself. It's this at odds combination of both cleverness and ego that ends up pushing Ozz to kill the next crime boss of the Falcone family. The act happens in a real fit of rage, because a young Alberto Falcone makes fun of Ozz in the opening episode of the series. Ozz is smart and friendly enough to put this up-and-coming boss, Alberto, in a situation where his guard is both down, and he's clearly feeling comfortable enough to not only drink his heart out, but reveal some pretty big secrets. Yet, it's Ozz's ego that pushes him to shoot and kill Alberto the moment Alberto starts making fun of him in his drunken stupor. And, as the Batman director and this universe's head architect, Matt Reeves himself put it in one of the Inside Gotham episodes that are attached after every episode, the rest of the series is really all about Ozz trying to recover from this impulsive act that he regrets almost immediately. And as the series goes on, we get to see just how clever and adaptive Ozz really is. He will, at times, easily talk his way out of dire situations, and failing that, will take more drastic and riskier measures to flip things in his favor. As the series starts out, it really feels like Ozz is a clever slimeball of a criminal that is as opportunistic and cold as they come. Yet, it's in the very same episode, the first one, that the show sets up some real nuance and complexity to Ozz's character, with the introduction of another character. In the same episode, where Ozz murders Alberto Falcone and attempts to set up and pit the rival Marconi family against the Falcones to cover his tracks, he also ends up taking in and forming a mentor-like relationship with a kid off the street in Victor. It's here that I think the team behind the series really demonstrates their ability to take and adapt various parts of popular and historical media and stories to their benefit. With the relationship that forms between Ozz and Victor, there's a real sense of channeling the Walter White, Jesse Pinkman dynamic from Breaking Bad. And given that the big MacGuffin in the story is the whole criminal underworld of Gotham fighting over a newly made drug that comes from Arkham Asylum, there's definitely a lot of stuff from Breaking Bad that's being taken inspiration from. And it's not just Breaking Bad either, as Ozz's complex, egotistical, and yet charming personality feels like it's coming straight out of The Sopranos, one of the greatest gangster mafia TV shows of all time. And then, of course, there's the entire vibe of the show that really harnesses the tone and feel from Jeff Loeb's run on the Batman comics, particularly the stuff in the long Halloween story arc that's so beloved by many comic book readers. So, Take elements from Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, the Long Halloween comic book, and set it all in Matt Reeves' version of Gotham that we first saw in the Batman, and you've got Max's The Penguin, right? Well, no, not exactly. If anything, I'd say that understanding and simplifying things like that is going a bit too far. Yes, it's obvious that Penguin takes inspiration from all of those stories and pieces of media, but I'd heavily argue that inspiration is just where it starts, not where it ends. See, what's so unique and impressive about the Penguin is that while it takes some elements from many popular stories and from entertainment media as a whole, it uses them and pushes them forward in a way that is both highly original and very different from whatever inspired all those things in the first place. And alongside all of that is some truly unique and original stuff as well. For one, the biggest and most welcome original element in the Penguin is a proper antagonist and adversary for Ozz in Sophia Falcone, played by Kristen Melody. Sophia Falcone is just as nuanced, complex, and interesting of a character as Ozz, and the show goes as far as almost making her a proper secondary protagonist. In the very first episode, as Ozz is seemingly about to get away with the murder of Alberto Falcone with the higher-ups of the crime family, it's Sophia that comes in and starts poking holes in his story, putting him back on shaky ground. And as the show goes on, we really start to unravel the complex history of these two characters and then ultimately see them go to war with one another. What's interesting here are the parallels the show draws between both characters in the beginning and ultimately the divergence that happens in the end. Both Ozz and Sophia are shown to be fairly damaged people who are trying to survive in a world and a reality that's both wronged and broken them at every turn. Both are victims and both inspire some sort of loyalty and friendship from the people around them. They're both fairly driven, ruthless people as well, and are playing mind games on a level that makes everyone else around them seem like children. Both also get progressively darker and fall deeper and deeper into depravity and violence as time goes on. But yet, both end up in very different places and become very different people after the events of the show are said and done. As the show peels back the layers of both characters, we learn that Ozz, despite all the seeming good he does for those around him, is ultimately a selfish sociopath that is in it for himself above all else. On the other side, Sophia, who starts off as someone trying to break free of her trauma and the betrayal from her father, ends up ultimately realizing that she's gone too far deep into the darkness and decides to get out of it all. The contrast here is interesting because both characters ultimately become more vicious and intense as time goes on. By the end, Ozz either kills or betrays almost every single character in the cast, including Sophia, his gangster allies, and even Victor. Sophia, on the other hand, ends up killing her entire family of abusers in the Falcone family, but ends up sparing the life of a young girl, and ultimately decides to burn down the entire criminal enterprise before she leaves it all behind. And stuck in between these two characters, their war and their separate character arcs, is Vic or Victor. Victor is really the representation of the downtrodden in Gotham. He's a resident of an area of Gotham known as Crown Point, and at the very start of the story, he loses everything thanks to the bomb that the Riddler unleashes in the Batman movie. Orphaned and alone, it's here that he runs into Ozz on the very night that Ozz takes out Alberto Falcone and is trying to cover his tracks. With nowhere to go, Vic slowly ends up not only impressing Ozz, but ultimately grows inspired and attached to him. Ozz gives Victor and the residents of the ruins of Crown Point both a means to survive via the drug trade, but even more importantly, as Vic himself puts it, dignity and a sense of purpose. Vic, therefore, throughout the 8-episode series, goes to bat for Ozz and saves him multiple times. and he ultimately comes into his own as both a leader and as someone who inspires the various smaller gangs to unite under Ozz. He also goes through his own little dark descent, starting out as a kid just trying to do what he can to survive, and ultimately killing a man and becoming a key crime figure in Ozz's organization. And, much like how Ozz and Sophia go through similar character arcs and end up in very different places by the end, Vic reaches his own very different destination that's just tragic. Speaking of which, tragedy is at the heart of not only the story of the entire series, but really every major character of note in the show. The way each character succumbs to their own character flaws and ultimately gets some kind of tragic ending is so classically Shakespearean that it almost screams to be or not to be at times. See, at the end, it's revealed that despite whatever seeming humanity the show hinted at with Ozz, he's ultimately every bit the villain that you think of when you think of the Penguin. There's no redeeming quality in him whatsoever, and everything he does is for himself. The show really does great work here, using both Vic and Ozz's own mother to successfully fool the audience into thinking that Ozz is a tragic victim that could have been a better human being if circumstances were different. Yet, in the show's last few episodes, we find out just how much of a monster Ozz really is. Ozz, it turns out, has a warped sense of reality to a point where he's both a victim and the main character in a story. The whole situation about wanting to take care of his mother is turned on its head when it's revealed that Ozz ultimately killed his two brothers to monopolize his mother's love. Then there's Vic and his eventual murder in the very last episode of the show, where Ozz, after growing so close with Vic and being saved by him multiple times, ultimately discards him in the coldest way possible. There's no grand murder or death scene. Ozz simply strangles Vic after a heart-to-heart talk, takes the money out of his wallet, and then throws Vic's ID into a nearby lake. And the implication here is clear. Vic was growing too much, becoming too important, and Ozz therefore removes him from the equation and turns him into a nobody, a nothing, as he discards his ID in the cold way that he does. And finally, there's what happens to Sophia in the end. She starts out by losing her brother to Ozz, and things only get worse from there. We find out that it was Ozz that ultimately led to her father imprisoning her in Arkham Asylum before the events of the story. Carmine Falcone does this, of course, to cover up murders that he himself committed. Sophia then spends 10 years tortured and broken down in Arkham, only to come back and have to form an uneasy alliance with Ozz when she's just starting out. Ozz then not only betrays her the first chance he gets, but steals her big drug play and ultimately goes to war with her. And even though Sophia tries to fight back, she gains control of the Falcone crime family and forms an alliance with the Maronis, she still ends up beaten by Ozz at the end of the show, and is set up to take the fall for the entire gang war and all of Ozz's schemes and machinations. In the end, Ozz not only comes out on top, but destroys everyone around him, including his mother, who suffers a stroke after being caught in between Ozz and Sophia's whole conflict over the drug and the crime underworld of Gotham. Ozz becomes the new kingpin of Gotham's underworld, but ultimately loses his mother, kills his most loyal friend and confidant, and destroys everyone and everything else. And at the end of it all, Ozz ends up making a fictional world and reality for himself, convincing him that he won and got everything he wanted, while ultimately paying too much of a price for it all. That ending is as Shakespearean as it gets. And speaking of Shakespeare and theater, man, is the acting of this show just leaps and bounds above anything we've seen in recent memory. Colin Farrell not only kills it as the Penguin, but elevates the character, creating a definitive portrayal of Oswald that will be remembered for years in the same way that I believe Heath Ledger's Joker is today. And Kristen Milioti as Sophia. She just pushes and pulls the show's spotlight away from Colin's Ozz at every point, bringing a performance that's every bit an equal. And I confess, when I saw Kristen Milioti in How I Met Your Mother all those years ago, I really didn't think she was this good of an actress. It's very similar to how Robert Pattinson, who played Batman himself, took his acting and renown to a level that hadn't been previously seen when he took on the role of Batman and Bruce Wayne in the Batman movie from 2 years ago. And that's to say nothing of the cinematography, the music, the costume design, props. Everything here is at a level that screams movie and film rather than a TV show. I mean, just look at the transformation of Colin Farrell from who he is into the Penguin. It was impressive in the Batman, and it's kept at the same level of movie magic in the TV show. And the artistry involved here is what really allows the show to not only stand out and be its own thing, its own work, but to be just really a good piece of crime drama entertainment. So yes, for all of those reasons and more, the Penguin ultimately succeeds in a way that I think everyone is going to love. The changes to the comic book version are stark, but they're so smart and so effective that I wouldn't be surprised if this version of the Penguin ends up replacing the other versions of the character as the definitive one. Similar to how Kevin Conroy's Batman in the animated series is still the definitive Batman. And that statement, coming from a longtime Batman fan like me, should indicate just how great this show really is. Now, there's one final thing to talk about before we're done talking about this show, and it has to do with someone we just talked about, Batman. Simply put, Batman is nowhere to be seen in this show, and while I generally am a fan of the idea that the Penguin should do its own thing, and really shouldn't rely on Batman, that just can't work in this particular case. The Penguin isn't a prequel series, but rather a direct sequel and continuation of the story and world established in 2022's The Batman. Yet, beyond one mention at the start of the series and then a final scene showing the bat signal at the end, Batman is pretty much non-existent in the story and show, which, despite how good the show is, really kills the overall consistency between this story and the movies that Matt Reeves is helming. It's said that both Ozz and Sophia are going to be part of whatever ends up happening in the second Matt Reeves Batman movie, and if that is the case, that makes this omission of Batman all the more baffling. It's unclear to me whether this was a stylistic decision as mentioned by both Matt Reeves and the showrunner in Lauren LeFranc, or whether there were other external factors at play. But ultimately, I do think that removing Batman from the equation entirely is a mistake. I mean, Matt Reeves did mention something interesting in an interview with Esquire.com. He said, and I quote, "A lot of the other movies, once they do their sort of origin tale, which of course is Batman and Bruce's, then they almost pass the baton over to the Rogues Gallery in such a way that their story actually is the story. But I really want this to continue to be a Batman point of view series of movies. So, one of the things that was really exciting about the opportunity to do a show was to let it really focus on that Rogues Gallery character and change points of view." What he's trying to say here, and it would ultimately make sense if Batman were at least somewhat of a presence in the show instead of being completely removed from it. I definitely think that the Penguin is stronger for focusing on Ozz Cobb and his point of view in the story, but acknowledging this universe's central character in Batman is almost necessary to keep the immersion and the illusion of this world from crumbling. Which, ultimately, is why I don't think you need to really concern yourself with how this all connects to the Batman movie or its eventual sequel. As it stands, The Penguin is a standalone story, a great one. As a piece of entertainment, as a story, as TV, it succeeds in a way that few things can. As a continuation of the world and the story established in The Batman, it mostly succeeds, but it's in that continuation angle that the only real blemish of the series is evident. Still, I think despite that one glaring issue, that the Penguin is still an amazing achievement, and it really does make me more excited for other stories in this Matt Reeves Batman universe, even more so than whatever James Gunn is cooking up for his own DC universe on the side. So yes, the Penguin is not only a great TV series, but also presents what I'd say is the best version of the Penguin character. And to kind of end this video, I'd really love to know what you thought of all of this. Did you love this version of the Penguin like I did? Was it too different from the original comics version? Was the exclusion of Batman as big of a sore spot for you as it was for me? And are you excited to see more of this universe, be it in TV or movies? Sound off in the comments below, as I'd love to discuss this further and deeper as we tend to do on this channel.